I think I've met many of you that are on the phone or joining today. But for those of you I haven't, my name is Adam Bolio. I lead the Entisys cyber risk division called Advised Cyber Risk Services. Uh, I've been in security and privacy for, almost 22 years now, and joined, about a year ago from Deloitte as we are launched this service. We have a lot of updates and things to share, and I hope to do that as we have some conversations going into this year. But today, I wanted to really just introduce myself. We're going to talk a little about data privacy, and I brought one of my former colleagues. We've worked together for quite some time back in Deloitte, and we have a lot of experience here around data protection and privacy. So I just want to, Rob, maybe take a second and introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Adam. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for attending here today. We appreciate the time. I'm Rob Eggebrecht. I'm a founder, or one of the founders, of a company called Cloudrise. Adam and I work together again at Deloitte in their cyber risk practice. I was one of the leaders in the data risk area, and prior to that, I built a couple of companies in the data protection area. Last one called IntelliSecure. But really excited to talk about the topic today and look forward to the discussion.
Perfect. So this next slide. So I'm just going to spend like 1 or 2 minutes to talk about, the advised business, and then we'll get right into the data protection. So, our value proposition, I've talked about it, I think, before in one of the webinars. It's our people, it's our network, our technologies. So, our people, a lot of the advice team have been in the businesses in terms of decades and not years, former leaders with a lot of experience. And that also adds to a large network. So we have networks within the industry. We have networks that include clients that are security and privacy officers in large organizations. So, we have the ability to leverage them or connect you with them to solve your problems. We also bring technologies. We have partnered with a lot of the largest cyber risk solutions, and even the IT technologies brought by Entisys, so we can really kind of help bring the full people, process, and technology. And then the collaboration, that's an example of that is here today with Rob, where, we have someone that I trust that has been in the data protection practice for, decades. And so I like to, when I provide services through in this type of forum, I can reach back into folks like Cloudrise and bring them forward so that you really get, very granular, very broad skill sets in data protection. Next slide. And this helps us kind of deliver, the full end-to-end program. I use data protection as an example here, but basically, when approaching like a data protection type project, someone might think about, we have to purchase some sort of technology, we got to get it implemented, but what they're not thinking about is the program governance, and how do we operate it after that? Do we even know where our data is and what is its classification? And then we have to develop use cases, and we have to tune our product. We have to integrate with other parts of the privacy program. All of this creates a lot of operational overhead, requires a lot of expertise. So, the advised difference is being able to bring that holistic picture to you so that, when you go out to purchase a technology or build a program, you don't have to go to multiple places, and we can kind of help you think about the whole roadmap right from its inception. So that's a small piece of advice and how we work. Now, next slide. All right, as we kind of get into data protection itself, we just pulled together a couple stats that are kind of interesting. Obviously the first one is really talking about the remote workforce. We've seen a huge growth in that because of COVID. I think it's TBD of how many businesses are going to require back on premise as this all settles. And I think more, there'll be quite a bit of folks that go back to work, but I think there's also going to be a permanent of kind of understanding of having a remote workforce and what that means in jobs descriptions that were never able to be remote now are. So it's here to stay is kind of what we're saying. And so that means data outside of the traditional perimeter. It means potentially unmanaged devices or different ways for accessing data. So it just creates a new challenge. And then leading into the second bullet, you can see the amount of data being collected and created It's astonishing because, it's 90% of the world's data has been created in the last 2 years. That's just mind-boggling to me. So it's just being created so quickly that how do we manage that with our current technologies and current resources? And then the third bullet is really around the increasing regulation, not just regulation, but consumer, demand for the right to understand what's being done with their privacy information. So several new legislations, like California, we had CCPA, and now we're introducing CPRA, which comes with its own legal arm for enforcement. So just a lot of things going on, that's creating more requirements for organizations to take action. And just kind of a small couple of tidbits on that. There is teeth. So, from GDPR, which is one of the legislations or regulations for doing business in Europe, British Airways was fined 228 million, and Marriott was fined over 124 million for exposing records for personal data. So you can see, like, there's a huge price tag to non-compliance. And then as we look at like GLBA, which is more for the financial organizations or financial clients, there's 5 years in prison or $100,000 fine for violation. So it's huge stuff. And then, basically the last bullet is basically saying 60% of organizations don't have the resources they need to really complete these compliance requirements. So it's a big challenge, and we're going to talk a little bit about today how to tackle some of this stuff. Next slide. So we have 4 use cases. Cloudrise, these are real use cases of how they're serving clients. They kind of fit back to the bullets I just talked about, the challenges around remote workforce, cloud and data growth, privacy regulations, and automation. So let's just jump right into it. All right, I'm going to let Rob just kind of chat a little bit, and then we'll get into each use case.
Great, thanks, Adam. So when thinking about data protection programs, I'm going to take a step back really quickly and kind of frame the discussion. Cybersecurity over the last 20 years, and there's been waves of really large initiatives, projects, budgets, and what I'll call business buy-in. As cybersecurity professionals, you guys probably are well aware that trying to find all the answers with the appropriate budget, with available resources, it's an art unto itself. And so, as we progressed through the 2000s, you had this perimeter-based security model, firewalls, IDS, IPS, and then people wanted to optimize that. So the evolution of the SIM came in place, and you're storing a lot of log data. You're looking at it. This is another trend. A lot of money has been put into that place. A lot of resources were, and then you had the evolution of the SOC threat hunting within those logs. Another large initiative, a lot of budget and a lot of resources put towards that. And I would say in the last really 5 years, you've had this wave of identity, and identity have been massive projects. They're usually tied to digital transformation projects. A lot of resources put towards them. The reason why I bring that up is I think the next wave is really taking a serious look at the data protection program. And when you look at Adam's previous slide of that iceberg, a lot of people, when it comes to cyber, DLP is synonymous with their data protection program. And DLP is just one arrow in the quiver of the technology stack. What we find, though, is that intermingled in these programs are also a lot of different people that are not your traditional cyber players. And so all of the previous technologies and kind of programs I talked about, they're very tech centric. And so you're going to get very engineer oriented talent. When you get into data protection, you're talking about bringing people that are compliance experts, audit, a lot of people that are directly involved in the business unit themselves, whether it's collections on billings for a hospital system, or it's payer provider information. And so what they're taking a look at is the risk of the data that's being exposed, how it's being used. They're not technical in nature. And so what happens is you get a very large surface area for a data protection program. And so what we want to do is talk about focus. And with these use cases, what I'd like to really make sure is we understand is looking at the specific areas and targeting really what matters to you. And it's very easy to get lost in a traditional data protection program by relying on the requirements of the capable technology. So when you look at this targeted approach, it's a busy slide. And the reason why is I made that purposely because a lot of these different arrows really don't matter. It's the shiny object. When building a data protection program, it's easy to spend a lot of time, resources, and budget that frankly, you will look back on and say, why did we end up going in that route? Where if you take a step back and really develop a lot of scope around what matters to your business, that's going to be the key success in these data protection programs. So let's go into the use cases, and I'll let Adam kind of tee these up, and then I'll walk you through these. Just to caveat with these, this is all real work. We just had to strip away the client names, surprise, surprise. But all this work took place between March of this year and to current date. So it's really relevant stuff. I hope you guys find it impactful because the world has changed quite a bit, but we'll also be able to relate it to, again, 20, 30 years of, frankly, the problem set of data protection.
Great, Rob. So, the first use case is really around the remote workforce. I mentioned it earlier that, it's here to stay. I've had a lot of clients, when COVID first kicked off, they're trying to open up the business basically to the remote workforce. What technologies do we need? How do we enable that? And I think, the focus was just getting operationalized. And I don't, security was a thought, but not always the only aspect, because the business has to move on. So I think there's probably a lot of concerns out there around, I have people outside the traditional perimeter, potentially on unmanaged devices or BYOD or, using Citrix, all sorts of different ways they're accessing the data. And so how do I manage this? And what are some ways to really kind of protect my data as it's kind of everywhere?
So if you look at this use case, and we left the Netscope logo in, it's the platform they're used. This isn't a commercial for any particular manufacturers. Just left it in there because that was the platform that they were using. This was pretty interesting because this was an organization that went from 60,000 people, of which 70% were divided among three major corporate headquarters in EMEA, APAC, and North America. And like the rest of the world, it's interesting, we're getting to this anniversary date. I can remember this is the last trip I took where I actually sat in an EDC room with a client. It was March of last year. And to watch these guys, they had to shift, and they didn't really have a very, what I would say, robust DLP program. And we were starting to work on that. And then suddenly everybody goes remote. And now they're looking at functionalities and capabilities. And one of the things that, Adam and I really like working together, and I think one of the reasons he trusts Cloudrise is it's one thing to be able to assess an environment and implement technology around data protection, frankly, any solutions. Where we've really carved out a niche is in automating all these siloed solutions. And the reason why I'm going to bring that up here is there's multiple areas of silo. In data protection, there's so many siloed solutions. O365 has DLP capabilities. Proofpoint has DLP capabilities. The web proxies have a data protection ISC capabilities. Then you have your on-prem DLP. Now you have this rapidly evolving world of CASB, SASE, whatever Gartner and Forrester are going to call it next. What's interesting about that is if you can build a program and start to garner information, but also responses that are triggered because you orchestrate all of those tools. And here what we did is they had Microsoft, I believe it was Microsoft AIP for classification. And they had put the Netscope platform in to really build cloud protection, deployed the client. And we said, hey, you know what? If you did some tagging on specific files that they found tremendously high risk, I mean, they sat down there and were like, this is the secret sauce. And so what we did is we did some tagging. And the idea was that when anything moved out into the cloud environment in this remote in this remote mode of operations, that it would get tagged. And rather than just creating an alert, we did specific bifurcation of functions. So essentially, if it went to an external share, downloaded, if it met that right criteria, it was blocked. Otherwise, it was in a passive monitoring mode. What's really neat about this is we replicated this process across many different types of platforms, whether it was McAfee and Sky-High, using Zscaler, etc. So the use case now becomes portable across a lot of different client sets. The end result here was that they started to build out the different, what I would call very high risk assets into the policy logic of their platforms, and they were able to expand the capability of monitoring this global remote workforce as they handled it was really intellectual property. And so interesting use case, and they were able to roll it out fairly quickly. Within 90 days, they were starting to take proactive action. So let me know if you guys real time have any questions, because we can go deeper into any of these. Want to know other classification tools we've seen, other platforms that we've done this with. But the genesis of this is actually like 20 years of on-prem DLP experience with understanding how to capture the requirements and how to actually build out policy set. Though that you apply this to a remote workforce, the platform that protects in the cloud, ultimately what you're doing is getting very good at capturing requirements to build the policy inside those platforms. Adam, I didn't know if you wanted to chime in on anything additionally on this one.
No, I just if anybody has any questions, you can type them into the chat, and we don't need to hold them to the end. If something inspires you, throw it in there. All right, so we'll move on to the next one. All right, so we sort of talked a little bit about it, with the remote user, how data is being pushed out, Office 365, other cloud venues, like, if we get into, you have ShareFile, we've seen a lot of hybrid cloud with clients where they have Azure, but then they might have, be using Azure for DevOps, but then they also have a traditional ShareFile or Box. It's kind of basically it's all over. They might have traditional DLP technologies kind of on-prem, things like that. But how do they, as they start to kind of look at the cloud and when the data is dispersed, can they get a single pane of glass, or how do they kind of pull the data together and organize it and in a way that they can manage it?
Yeah, so this one was a really interesting project because it's very typical of what we're finding out there in the marketplace right now, where I think people thought that we're going to have a longer glide path to transitioning from, the DLP has always been like a four-letter word and a three-letter acronym. The programs are typically expensive. There's an art to reading them. It is a lot of requirements gathering, integrating it into the business. And I also call DLP kind of a self-inflicted pain, because what you're doing is you're setting up a system that's proactively going to detect contextual analysis. And so it's not like other security tools that are looking for patterns of ones and zeros typically. DLP, the more effective it is because the more time you put in the requirements. And what happened is a lot of people who are already struggling with DLP were thrown into this world of, hey, we now need to apply data protection controls into cloud environments. And the first thing that happened was, and with this client specifically, is they had to take a step back because a lot of different people, especially in the CASB market, it is so crowded. So we've done, it was interesting when Adam and I first met, we just started in the Deloitte area, and we were building out the CASB practice there about 4 or 5 years ago. And it was, we did a market survey. So you looked at BitGlass, Sky-High, Netscope, Zscaler, what Palo had put together, what Broadcom essentially is kind of built up and torn apart. But ultimately, a lot of our clients, especially this one, faced the idea of, everybody thought that, hey, Microsoft 365 has MCAS, so we can use the CASB over here, and it has some DLP capabilities. And then, hey, I have Proofpoint over here, or I'll bring some old names to the table. We just had a client who was talking about Zix. The point I'm trying to make is there's all of these siloed controls that have these capabilities with data protection, and then you have a group of them that was developed for on-prem. The manufacturers have tried to pivot them to fit cloud-first sort of environments, and then you have this new group of technologies that are very cloud-centric. And so with this client, the first thing they had to do is they had to take a step back and quickly assess which tools are we going to put the weight of our time and effort as the foundational technology. And what happened is they were now going across multiple different operating groups. So the infrastructure and the network team were like, hey, we're going to be involved in this proxy and CASB discussion. And then you had the data protection team who was like, hey, the DLP capabilities inside these platforms is really where we want to focus. So we came in, they were using a lot of different tools. They hadn't really assessed, and they didn't want to take time for, a 12 or 24-week assessment in the middle of a pandemic. And so what we did is we took a really quick look at what they had in place. And the first thing we did from a low-hanging fruit perspective is we harmonized DLP policies across the platforms that we thought would give them best opportunity to get accuracy and a comprehensive program to build around policy logic when it came to DLP. And one of the things I can tell you right off the bat is if you think you're going to rely on O365 DLP, that product itself doesn't have a lot of tune capabilities within inside the policy logic engine. So in this case, we moved the client away from that. We were able to start working with other different platforms. And then they also had foreign language requirements that needed to be applied. The bottom line is you quickly came in, you harmonized the policy logic between the platforms that you wanted to use. What that does is, as you see here, the overhead was reduced. What do I mean by policy overhead? Well, you're not trying to maintain all of these different data protection policies and all of these individual siloed systems. And then another piece of it that we're finding very interesting in the marketplace right now is everybody talks about that single pane of glass. Probably the best place in cyber to get a single pane of glass reporting is in a SIM solution or a Splunk, right? Because that's where all your log aggregation takes place. That information is typically very log and cyber centric. And what I mean by that is it isn't very business rich intelligence. What we're finding is with this client, they had a Tableau reporting team. And what happens is inside the business, whether it's cyber or anything on the revenue generating side or the cost side of the business, bottom line is if they need to extract information out of systems, they have a Tableau team that they take capture requirements, run the information across Tableau, and then develop reports and move them out. We actually helped this client with capturing the requirements from the different data protection platforms, and then it would get stored, and this was all automated. When I talk about automation, there's lots of different ways to accomplish this. One is if you have a SOAR platform, a security orchestration and automation response platform, whether that is Palo or Splunk, formerly known as Demisto or Phantom, Helix from Microsoft, there's a ton of them out there. We can develop the policy logic inside those systems to enable this automation. If you don't have any of those, it's typically script writing that will build out. In this case, what we did is we took information from O365, it was Sky High Networks, and the Google Suite of Information, productivity, and we brought it into a Snowflake temporary data warehouse. And then from there, we wrote all the requirements and built the dashboards and the reports inside Tableau. Bottom line is rather than these people swivel chairing and all trying to go into those individual platforms that enable the data protection program, now what happens is the requirements have been brought back into a centralized repository. And whether you want to call it a single pane of glass, what you're doing is you're delivering business intelligence and risk information to the people inside the business that need it. And it's based on, again, all requirements. And typically what we look for is existing tool sets. Do they have Looker, Tableau, Power BI from a reporting standpoint? How are you going to tie this information together? And ultimately, heading into this year, what they're doing now is just rolling out more and more areas that they want to add scope to their data protection program. So last year we started out very targeted with PCI information, some elements that make up GDPR, and specific elements of IP. So this is as we progress further, they're expanding the IP capabilities. And then what they're doing is they're looking at different platforms that they use in the business to handle this information. As you can see here, we're now at a Box, G Drive, Slack, SFDC, ServiceNow, and now they have some custom applications as well. So there's a program here that you can build. I think one of the things I would work on here is if you have a business partner that comes in that wants to help you secure data in these environments and do kind of what I call cyber transformation, but take a close look at their timelines and their ability to execute kind of on an agile software development basis. And why I think that is very important is in this new day and age of data is being created at this astonishing rate, and you're working in a very remote environment where changes need to happen as frankly, the staff flexes for business operations, you're going to want to find a partner who can do this stuff quick and fast, and you want to make sure that automation is a key to their story. That was a lot, but there was a lot of, I think there's a lot of interesting places.
Rob, yeah, and I think what resonates with me on this is the conflicting business. I don't want to say conflicting. The business groups that require different information aren't always aligned, right? And so, like if we take healthcare, for example, you have security who's really trying to enforce privacy, but then also security threats that they're managing. But then you actually have a privacy team who's maybe looking at different aspects of how users are using data or snooping in an EHR, for example, things like that. And oftentimes they're different teams, but then, you also have like the e-discovery and the kind of malicious insider threat thing going on. And so there's all these different facets, and I've even seen clients buy different programs that are not even aligned whatsoever. And so they could be missing the integration. So I think the ability to bring in, like if a company's about to, if somebody quits kind of in a malicious way, there could be automation to pull like what have they been doing the last 60 days with cloud storage, or whatever insider threat type example. But the tie into HR, the tie into compliance and privacy and security, I just think, what you talked about around that program integration would be a huge value benefit.
Quickly touch on that. We can move to the next slide to get it framed up. But there's a pharmaceutical firm we worked with for the last 12 months, and they had multiple platforms. They had a CASB on-premise DLP, email security gateway. But the bottom line is they had a process that was very manual, and it would take almost, I think, 46 hours a week it was to derive this specific information, which was take information from Workday. It was their source of truth globally, so it was broken up into global regions, and then run a report on a weekly basis of who had resigned or terminated, and they batched that behavior, resignation and termination, into one bucket. And so through this process, the current state we ran into was grab that information from Workday, manually download it, one bucket, upload it against, it was O365, Proofpoint, and Netscope, and see what the activity was of people downloading or moving specific data elements prior to them leaving or terminating in 60 days. And then they would download those results from the 3 different platforms, put them into a spreadsheet, and then pivot table, build a report, and then email it out to these 5 business heads who then had to decide globally on how to disseminate that information based on risk. So 46 hours a week, there's this one woman that she's based in the US, and she hated this process because it was so manual. Ultimately, what we were able to do is through automation is we could go say, hey, Workday, download this information automatically to these platforms. And by the way, bifurcated into 2 groups, which is terminated, that's a different profile. I probably want to have different behaviors on the back end versus resigned. And then when it fed into those platforms, not only to look at behaviors the past 60 days, but looked at them based on specific DLP policies. And then in the terminated user's perspective, we could actually enable policy enforcement automatically. So it went and said hello to these solutions. I want to block here, here, and here on this policy. And then that information was all pulled into, it was interesting, they were a big Microsoft shop. We pulled it all into SharePoint online, and then we built Power BI dashboards. So they owned all these tools, and the reports were automatically built. And then we interviewed the 5 business leaders, and we said, how do you like information delivered to you? And some people were like, I really like Teams. Other people said, hey, I like Slack. Other people said, I want email. And we had another person say, hey, I like a dashboard. What a surprise. 5 different behaviors for how people like to see their information. And so we specifically set up the communication channels on the back end to facilitate the delivery of information on a weekly basis that was provided in a consistent format. And we took that from 46 hours a week to 6 hours a week. Right now, that woman in the US who does this, it's strictly a review process. The script and the automation, frankly, have tied all of that together. And I think that is the key in data protection programs. There are so many providers and partners you could work with that are going to come to you and go, yeah, I'm really good at assessing the environment and enabling this one-point solution over here. I sold you a solution, now I'm going to implement it. I think that that whole process is completely dated, and the providers and partners that you want to look for now are the ones who are going to understand how data lives inside your environment, and then how to stitch together the tools that are going to provide you the best ability for risk reduction in the shortest period of time in a real-time environment. So that was a lot. Sorry. Addressing privacy regulations in this cloud adoption, Adam, you can tell me what you see out in the marketplace.
Well, I think, we talked a lot about technologies, and I think, you mentioned, bringing them into the single pane of glass or whatever, central storage so people can manage it. But I think that, when we talk about this one, there's a lot more around the process and the program. You can't just solve this with with a new technology. And I think there needs to be a lot of time put into understanding the requirements. As we're getting into, if you're an organization that manages a large, or maybe even makes a large percentage of your business is on the privacy data, whether it's selling it or selling research, things like that. Now you got to track who you're giving it to, and there's just a lot more requirements. And I think you need to kind of build a robust program around that, and it needs people resources as well as technology. So just wanted to get your thoughts on that alignment of kind of what I'm thinking, and how you might have helped others with that side of the house.
Yeah, so I brought this one up, and it was funny when we were going through the slides and preparing for today's presentation. We kind of all agreed there's, whether it's CCPA, GDPR, I mean, wow, go all the way back 20 years to when HIPAA first came out, or the privacy rule, or the security regs, GLBA, etc. What I found interesting about pulling this use case was I tried to think about clients that we worked with who are going through that privacy and compliance journey. And many of them have a really good cadence of going through this because they've been in these crosshairs for 2 or 3 decades now. What changed and why I brought this up as a use case is the shifting sands of when a client has to deal with privacy or compliance regulations, and now they're put into a cloud-first environment. And data is heavily reliant on the requirements of the third party, whether it's a service provider in the cloud, or you've built your own cloud apps if it's an IaaS, big infrastructure type discussion, or if it's more, hey, it's out in the SaaS business app world. What makes it really interesting, I think, and challenging is the fact that now your information is stored in so many areas, and the complexity and then the reliance on a keen understanding of the third party provider. What is Microsoft or GCP or AWS? What do they guarantee from a privacy perspective? How much visibility and granularity can they give you to cross-border data, and how they're load balancing their systems? And then that transitions over to the same thing. I'll pick some of the big SaaS providers. We see so many people building, Salesforce.com 10 years ago was really seen as a CRM tool. Now you see all of this business workflow built into it that contains personal information. And so I think with this use case, and something I would keep in mind is if you are really cloud first or you're moving to a heavily weighted cloud strategy, one of the things you're going to have to take into account is what is the business impact on the privacy regulations. And this is an area where I do think there's much more, there's a much greater need for consultancy and really understanding the program objectives. And then the tech sort of comes behind that big program build. It's the same for data protection. But what I find with data protection, core data protection, not let's say driven by a requirement for privacy and CCPA, et cetera, is protection programs, because people have built out DLP programs for the last 20 years, they have a head start there. Where on the privacy and compliance side with tech, uh, there's just a new evolution of a lot of tools that are specifically optimized or designed to help automate the privacy process. And so with data protection, I feel like 80% of the problem can be addressed through better optimization and automation of the tech stack. With privacy, I still think you're probably where you were with data protection 20 years ago, which is 80% is building the right program right now. And I know that the Entisys360, their advice team, that's a specialty that they carve out. Where I see us partnering with them is probably on some of the newer tech that's coming out there, like Discovery, the companies like Big ID in compliance, OneTrust. They've been out there for a while, but also companies like Security AI. These are some of the new firms that were just coming out of Silicon Valley to address through tech some of these privacy issues. And then the pandemic hit. I think you would have saw a lot more noise in the marketplace and probably a lot more knock on the doors from those manufacturers. But ultimately, to answer, it's a very long-winded answer to your question. There's a lot of time that needs to be built on the program through just interviews and assessment and privacy. So we would call that comes in.
All right. So I think the last use case is going to be the fun one, right? So Fiza, you could, yeah. So basically, automation is the subject here, and I think that you mentioned one of the cases around resignation and termination. I think that was a cool use case. But again, kind of reflecting on the different business units that consume data protection and privacy. You have folks that are maybe privacy compliance professionals, but they're not like incident responders, so they might not be like looking for the same type of things or as effective. So there might be a training gap. There might be just kind of a different programmatic view based on the business user. So I think there's ways to kind of expedite that or make it more accurate, or just get them the data they need sooner. And then, it also feeding into making sure we're taking the right action to prepare ourselves for incident response. If we find out that somebody did potentially steal data or whatever, do we have forensic investigation, the forensic materials we need? Did we collect that prior to, do we have the logs? Do we have the data prior to them leaving, where we would be able to conduct an effective investigation on that? And so I think that, this is a case where potentially the automation can collect that data or look for things that, maybe an untrained professional wouldn't look for. So different kind of things like that. I think there's so much, and then obviously just the time savings potential. With the pandemic, there's a lot of budgets that have either been cut or they're on kind of a maintenance mode. There's more regulation, less budget. So how do we do all that? So I think this is a super exciting topic to end our day on. So Rob, your thoughts?
Yeah, I have lots of thoughts on this. As we were saying when we were prepping for this, I could spend an hour just talking about this slide. This is the reason why, frankly, we peeled off and sorry about that, started up Cloudrise. Was 20 years we've been building data protection programs, and we've been, God, long in the tooth. We started off when this team that founded Cloudrise, when the DLP providers were Vericept and Port Authority, it turned into WebSense, it turned into ForcePoint. I could go on and on. The interesting thing that got us really excited about doing a new startup in the area of data protection was privacy. is there is so much manual work that is done, and the solutions are so siloed. So if you look at the Silicon Valley or the coasts where you develop, whether it's Austin, Boston, Oregon, Silicon Valley, or Israel, let's say, a lot of the SaaS-based solutions, their whole idea is how do you make things faster, easier for your clients, and find a problem set that is common across those all of those customers, right? That's the SaaS model, the thesis, how they get their leverage, and why there's just this huge gold rush to building SaaS apps. And specifically in cyber, what we saw was in data protection and privacy programs, the first issue that remains the same. And I know if you guys on the call are directly impacted or indirectly, what you'll find is it's usually a headache. Lots of reports to pull. Again, you have to have all these different siloed solutions, and it's very hard to staff around data protection, privacy, technology, and those requirements because, as I stated at the beginning of the webinar, you have a lot of people that are very business oriented in their careers that don't have that depth of tech breadth when it comes to just, let's say, configuring a script or to writing advanced reporting out of a business logic tool like, again, Power BI, Looker, etc. So not only do you have all these disparate tools and you have all this data that's just a multiplier effect upon one another, but then you have a staffing issue as well. So we thought this was a ripe opportunity to be able to come in and address it through automation. And automation, it's not a blanket statement. So I'm going to use some examples here that we've done. We're about 16 months old. We have just about 50 customers, and most of our conversations start in cloud security, data protection, etc. But as we get to know the client environment, we start asking questions of what are labor intensive. I'll give you a great example. And we find this at just about every one of our clients. It's called PAR, periodic access review. There's probably some of you sitting there going, oh, is he really going to talk about this ugly topic? And this is essentially figuring out who has access to what systems and what information. It's heavily compliance driven. It's an annual process for some. It's a quarterly process for others. In other cases, they do a big annual and other quarterlies. But the reason why I bring this up is I'll give you a great client example. It is almost an FTE's job to maintain this quarterly and on an annual basis. And then they sprinkle in all of these different players from the identity team that has to pull information from the PAM solutions and the IAM solutions, whether it's SailPoint, Okta. That's a supporting piece. It's not an answer to the process typically. And then we'll find that there's some data discovery or system discovery tools, whether it's a Varonis out there. They're trying to tie in information about whether file access or user access. So maybe they're even running DLP scans from an old school on-prem DLP solution. Now what we're seeing is people leveraging cloud-based scanning to get other pieces of the puzzle. So what we did is we came in, and the initial engagement was 30 days. And this is how a lot of these automation engagements start, is essentially what you're doing is you're rolling out the current state for these processes. And you show every person, technology, people, process, technology, the hours they're spending, the tools they touch upon, and all the information they have to draw down. And in many cases, I think people expect us to come back and go, hey, we're going to automate this in the script. It'll be from point A to point Z, and it's all automated. It's typically not the case. What we will typically find is there are areas for automation. And then what we're going to do is we're going to look at the company's maturity and their ability to architect automation. And if you think about it, automation comes down to coding. So do they have any native tools like SOAR platforms that are available that if they capture the requirements, delivered them to the people that run that platform? I think this is one of the great failures of the SOAR market, is it's been so cyber-centric and SOC-centric that they built this really cool automation tool for cyber, but really what they've, where it gets mostly used is to investigate an incident in a more effective way, but it doesn't get used to, let's say, automate other processes like cap that resigned employee. that script that we built could easily be housed in one of those SOAR platforms. So that's one of the first things we look at from an automation standpoint. And if from a customer basis, when you guys are listening to this webinar, the first thing I would think about when you start thinking, hey, maybe I can automate something, some of these processes in my data protection program, is how comfortable is your team with capturing requirements for a business problem? And then do you have the people, I equate this like building a house. One is to get the architectural design. So do you know the right questions to ask? And then once it's documented, then do you have the builders on site to actually build you that automation? And so I find it rare in cyber organizations, unless they're very large, that they have a dedicated team of business intelligence or what we call product integration and software development expertise. They can code in Python, Golang. Ultimately, what you're getting at is, do I have access to resources that can code out the automation? The third issue is, and we find a lot of what I call the rogue scripts, people that someone found a kid that could write scripts inside the organization. They write a script, but no one maintains it. When the script breaks, people are frustrated. They're trying to hunt down who wrote the script. And so the third question you need to ask yourself is, am I going to be able to maintain this automation? And frankly, is it worth the time and money to expend upon it? Once you've kind of sat back and asked those questions, well, then either you're going to do it in-house or you can work with someone like a Cloudrise, for counting the horn here. But what we'll be able to do is come in quickly, gather those requirements, and then determine where you build the automation, and then we can figure out where automation can live. Again, if you have an existing source system, we're doing this with a client right now. It's a global gaming company, and they essentially had Resilient. Resilient was a SOAR platform that was bought by IBM back in 2016. This is a common case. The data protection team came to us and said, hey, our cyber team said we have this automation platform, and we would really like to automate our ability to take information from a CASB in our DLP system, so on-prem and cloud, and we'd like to dump that information into, I think it's Athena, it might be Snowflake, and then we would like to run Power BI reports against it. And so they said, can you build that automation inside Resilient? And we absolutely could. So you're building out a playbook in that native platform that they have in place. Another great example of automation, as I said, that resigned versus terminated employee use case. There's lots of ways to skin that cat. And I think ultimately what you're looking for is the business objective. And then we kind of walk through a waterfall decision making when it comes to automation of assess through people, process, work instruction, policy, and procedure. If the organization has no capabilities at automation, the first step is, can you optimize that through just basic process design? And that's an interesting way of going improving your operations and data protection. But then the second step is, and a lot of the manufacturers, and you guys hear this all the time, and I know your inboxes are getting rattled by software providers right now, and their key theme is buy our SaaS solution and it'll automate all of this for you. We call that the native capabilities of a platform. And ultimately what we're trying to figure out there is, without writing any code or scripts or leveraging a source solution, can you use APIs and all these different platforms to talk to one another and get some form of automation there? And there's a lot of opportunity there. And then the third piece is, finally, I have disparate systems, whether it's HR, truth of source like Workday, or I have an HIS system, healthcare. This is ripe for opportunity. I mean, we have several healthcare providers where we're taking information from multiple DLP systems running against Epic. I could list off all the different HIS medical record sort of systems, but then what you're doing is you're writing code to automate. And this is an area where really you just need to start the journey with one project. And we call it cyber digital transformation. And we focused all of these efforts traditionally around data protection programs because, again, I believe that is the next biggest wave for companies to initiate large transformational projects. And the second piece is that there's just so many manual processes that it's a natural place to start. So
Thanks,
again,
Rob.
I can take more on this.
Yeah,
There you
I
go.
have a couple questions that were sent in, but I just want to be, is there anybody else on the phone that has a question? We have about 6 minutes left. So is there anybody that wants to voice a question?
And note that you're all muted, but you are free to type in the Q&A section.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Bill. Rob, while they're typing in, I do have a question that came in that I had a couple come in, but I have one that I think is pertinent to this conversation around showing the value of the data protection tool set, because like if they're going to make investments in the technology or in the people process, maybe you could spend just like 2 minutes on things you've seen that have been value to either reporting to the board or to the people who are holding the purse.
Yeah, so it's really difficult. You see a lot of people take the cost of a data breach, these out there, the Poneman group, and everybody has this $300 record, multiply it times the records, etc. I'd like to believe that we are past that in the place that you amplify your messaging of why your data protection program is valuable. I would like to believe that very concise management reports and board level reporting should be driven on why this is benefiting the business and explaining what the risks are to the business, and doing that in a very succinct and concise fashion. Again, I've been in startup world kind of my whole life, except my detour at Deloitte, and I'm used to presenting to boards and investors and customers most importantly. And what I find is the story that people want told, they want it told in a very defined, concise manner that is quick to explain, and someone who's non-technical or not a subject matter expert of risk or compliance can understand. And I think that is where what I call telling the story. And what you're seeing here at Cloudrise is we're hiring a lot of business analysts to be able to jump into clients' data. And one of the biggest things we work on with them is how do you communicate the value of your program and what are going to be those key performance metrics. And the way I try to stimulate that discussion is, if I looked at our own company, I look at the revenue generating parts of it, and I ask our chief revenue officer, give me one slide that shows me the most important things that are relevant to our revenue generation. From a CISO perspective, I look at them and I go, what puts us out of business? From a risk perspective, sending the wrong client data, cross-pollinating client data as a service provider in cyber would be a terrible thing to happen. The point I want to make is that if you can tell that story and then you can figure out a way to consistently tell it. And I was getting at this with the pharmaceutical example with the resigned employees. One of the biggest complaints that you get out of cyber in general from a reporting perspective from people inside the business is the reporting comes in consistently. I question the accuracy. The formatting is in a foreign language. And then you guys are all running into the same problem in the back end, which is staffing is fluctuating. So we're keeping consistency of the human being that maintains that process. I argue that that's the best place for automation, because automation, then you're elevating your resource to do the smart thinking, which is to go out and talk to your audience about what they want to see and coach the audience. What you're doing with automation is you're enabling that process of capturing the data, storing the data, telling the story, and then communicating the data. If you can get that into an automated pattern, then your areas of consistency, accuracy, and frankly, formatting can all be solved. And it doesn't matter the human resource on the back end if they leave or switch out positions within inside the organization, because you've automated what I call, frankly, the most mundane part of that process, and you've elevated your staff to do the most important piece, which is again, not only ask the questions of the audience, but coach those people on why this is important and why you're giving them this information. And then they get hooked. And then if a report doesn't show up every week, they go, hey, where is this?
Right. So thanks, Rob. I just want to thank everybody for the time today. We're wrapping up. I kind of left with this last slide that basically through the Advise and Cloudrise partnership, we can do everything from the assessments to building the program, technology enablement, and then some of the cool automation Rob talked about today, as well as, if there's need to help augment your staff, we have availability to do managed services to help you kind of manage your program. But if you have any questions, you can reach out to me or the team, and we'll send this presentation out to everybody and make the webinar available on our website. Thank you very much. Thanks, Rob, for coming.
Adam, thanks for having us. We appreciate it. Hope everybody stays safe, and thanks for your time.
All right.